Thanks so much, Audra, for the introduction, and to you and NUIPIC for allowing us to be part of this series. It's nice to see we've got like over 40 people on, so we're excited to share a little bit of information about what we've been doing as far as wetland monitoring and assessment goes in Rhode Island, and hopefully we can, collaborate after this webinar. Anybody who's interested or is working on similar stuff, we would love to connect with you. So please feel free to submit questions today or follow up with us afterwards. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of an introduction and provide a little bit of context, and then Tom's going to jump into really the rapid assessment method that he's developed for us, but we thought it'd be helpful just to put that in context a little bit for you. So let's see. So really this effort got started when we were able to, in 2016, DEM had been working under a wetland program development grant on freshwater wetland monitoring and assessment. And in 2016, they expanded that work, and we were able to kind of partner with them to include coastal wetlands in their wetland work. And so we developed this interagency partnership. The Rhode Island Natural History Survey came on board and is basically carrying out a lot of the work under that grant. And so we pretty much, the CRMC directs the coastal portion of this work with Tom as the main point person there, and which is great because he's also doing the freshwater wetland assessment and monitoring work. So it's nice to have both of those areas under one program. We can look more closely at the nexus between the two and how they relate to each other, and it just provides for a little bit more consistency, whereas before they were kind of split between our two agencies. So I think it's been a really valuable partnership, and our thanks to DEM for helping to make it happen. So one of the first things that Tom helped us complete was he was the lead author on our Rhode Island Coastal Wetland Restoration Strategy. So this kind of lays out a strategy for coastal wetland restoration in Rhode Island. It's the main guidance document for the wetland portion of the Rhode Island Coastal and Estuarine Habitat Restoration Trust Fund that Audra mentioned in my intro. So we have a pot of state funding that's allocated to restoration projects every year. And so we really need to have a plan in place for spending those state resources, and this helps us to do that. There's a focus in this document on regional functions and values, and basically the vision, and we wrote this, it's kind of an updated version of what was an existing plan that went with the fund, and the vision for this version was looking at what we were seeing as far as model predictions and monitoring results that were indicating that we were seeing high rates of loss, wetland loss, a lot of it related to sea level rise, accelerated sea level rise. So taking that into consideration, what is our strategy going forward as far as management and restoration actions? So the focus is really on preserving critical functions and values, ecosystem services, minimizing loss, but also preserving functions and values and ecosystem services across broad systems, so trying to look at the system as a whole. So it was great to get that document completed. Within the document, we talk about the various tools in the toolbox we have for implementing these wetland projects. So they're kind of separated into two broad bins. One would be we're calling ecological restoration, focuses mainly on in-marsh activities. So that would include kind of traditional restoration projects, tidal restorations, fill removal, and then some of the newer techniques like the runnel projects that we've been working on with Save the Bay, things like sediment placement projects to address elevation deficits. Those are kind of the in-marsh activities. And then there's this other kind of suite of activities we're looking at that we call the intervention continuum. And so those are activities that have a longer kind of time horizon, looking at things like marsh migration. So removing obstacles to marsh migration, managing buffers. So really working on farther up on the landscape to plan for a future where sea levels are higher. So supporting the migration of those habitats. So the restoration strategy has kind of helped us to organize our thinking around those topics. The actions that we take based on the strategy are very much informed by the monitoring and assessment we do statewide. And these activities are carried out by a number of different partners, and they're summarized. The strategy is kind of summarized nicely in this document here, which was written by Ken Raposa with Tom Wenley-Ferguson and Marcy Cole-Eckberg. Tom was at Save the Bay at the time, and Robin Weber at the Research Reserve. So this kind of lays out a strategy for marsh monitoring throughout the state. And it takes a three-level approach. So we have a three-tiered strategy that starts at the landscape level. Tom's going to talk about the rapid assessment portion of this strategy. And then there's a tier 3, which is a little bit more intensive and high resolution. So I'm just going to go over briefly tier 1 and 3, and then I'll let Tom jump into the tier 2 rapid assessment, which is what we're going to focus on today. So just to give you some context, so the level 1 would be our marsh habitat classification, and this work is carried out by Robin Weber at the Narragansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. It's basically analysis of aerial photos using e-cognition software, so spectral analysis and mapping wetlands statewide into different cover classes. So this is great. It's a broad overview of the different ratios of different cover classes within our wetlands. It kind of gives us a high-level statewide view of things. As we think, the overall accuracy is estimated at about 83%. We have one set of these maps for the 2012 imagery, and we're working on getting maps for the 2016 imagery. So I think it's yet to be determined whether we can use these maps to detect change over time, but ideally that would be something that we would look at. So that's our tier 1. And then our tier 3 basically is the NERS Sentinel Site program. And so this is basically the intensive on-the-ground monitoring at the Research Reserve Sentinel sites. We're adding additional sites, but you can see here there's a list of parameters that are being looked at. And this is very high resolution data collection. And so we're looking at things like vegetation, accretion rates, water levels, soil shear strength, nekton, and that type of thing. So that's a deep dive into these parameters. And again, we've built on the existing NERS sites, and we're adding additional sites to this level 3. So now we'll move on to our tier 2, which is kind of in between the two, the broad overview, and then the Sentinel site monitoring, which is this rapid assessment method. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our salt marsh rapid assessment method, which we creatively called MarshRAM. And level 2 rapid assessment is unique in that you can collect pretty reliable site level data across multiple sites in a single season. And it allows you to be able to set up a gradient or condition categories which can support management, decision making. So we had a couple of rapid assessment methods for salt marshes already that had been tested in the state. One was the New England Rapid Assessment Method by Mark Carullo and Chaffee. The other was called RISMA with the Rhode Island Salt Marsh Assessment. And they both were analyzed and had a lot of really good components. NERAM focused on disturbances. RISMA focused on integrity from sea level rise. So we figured, we really should merge these two and try to get everything that we need to support management into a single method. So that's basically what we did here. So we tried to have it pretty broad. It's in 5 main sections. The first is characteristics and classification. These aren't scored. These are just to categorize the salt marshes, which is helpful for analysis. A landscape condition metric, and then two main metrics, two main indices are in-wetland disturbances. There's 10 metrics for in-wetland disturbances that create an index. And then there's an index of marsh integrity that we call the IMI. And then we have a rapid marsh migration metric, which is specific for individual marshes, which, and we'll look at all of these. So rather than giving you screenshots like the previous page of this thing as we go through it, I figured, you know, we'll look at some real data. You can see how messy my data collection is. And we'll look at a specific site, and we'll go through it with a specific site in mind, and maybe it'll be a little bit more interesting for you. So I'll introduce to you Winnapaug Pond. This is a moderately big salt marsh for Rhode Island anyway, 10-hectare salt marsh. It's in the southwest corner of Rhode Island. If you look at the lower right-hand photo, you can see that it is on a barrier spit between the ocean and a coastal lagoon, which is low energy. So this particular marsh has been under consideration for restoration for some type of management. I think, you know, looking at thin layer placement, because, you know, anecdotally we see it drowning in place. So I thought this would be a good marsh to look at. This is one of 31 marshes we looked at over the last couple of years and ran the MarshRAM on. Let's get into the MarshRAM itself. So if we look on the left-hand side here, the first section is marsh characteristics. Again, these are not scored in any type of index or aggregated into an index. We have marsh unit area, the position in the wetland. This is specific to Rhode Island here. Marsh setting and type, so geomorphic setting, which I just basically got from coastal geology literature. Whether it's a platform or a fringe marsh, what the adjacent upland type is, tidal water salinity, freshwater input, where that comes from. Number 4, exposure to tides. So, you know, high exposure would be maybe a marsh island would be 100% exposure. It means the tides can access the marsh on all sides. And it's just for categorization for analysis, thought that might be important. Effective fetch of the tidal water, tidal range. We don't have it for most of our sites, but we're working on collecting it right now, actually. Natural habitat diversity, so no frag, no ditches, just, you know, how diverse is this platform? Just gives us an idea for comparison. Also, connectivity of natural habitats. And then number 7 is really a quick and coarse functions and values assessment. You know, just sort of nested within this assessment. And if you look at the right-hand side in the little box, there's a ranking system, anywhere from not evidently provided to evident or known importance to special importance if it, you know, if it was like an educational marsh associated with a university or something. So all the basic functions and values that you get from the literature and a ranking system. Now, I couldn't help but to aggregate these and sum them up and come up with an index that we use in management. And you'll see that, I'll show you in the context later. Wasn't really intended that way, but we couldn't help it. Same thing with count of water birds. So when you're out in the marsh doing a rapid assessment, you know, you see birds and you mark it down in the margin. Oh yeah, there were a bunch of wading birds. Mark that in the margin. Well, we figured we might as well, let's standardize it a little bit. We'll treat it for what it is. It's a single snapshot. We do all these assessments at low tide, so it's, you know, at least something standardized. It's all during the peak of the growing season. Snapshot of what birds are out there, including marsh sparrows. But also wading birds, songbirds. You can see that. Okay, so the next is just a surrounding land use metric. This comes right from RIRAM, which is our freshwater assessment. It just looks at, see the red buffer zone there, which is 150 meters. It's just a weighted index based on landscape development index, but way simplified. just into 4 categories, and it's just what proportion to the nearest tenth of these various categories from very low to high land use intensity there are surrounding in that buffer surrounding, and it comes up with a score for surrounding land use. So this particular wetland gets a 6.9 out of 10, and it's just to compare with other wetlands, gives some idea of setting. And then the next section is wetland disturbances. So this is one of the main indices. This will be the wetland disturbance index. There's 10 metrics that go into this index, just typical salt marsh disturbances. They're each scored pretty coarsely based on the intensity of the disturbance. And with that, you'll see in the boxes, if you look at buffer encroachment, which is C1, it gives you what the specific stressor is that's causing the disturbance, but also it gives you a sort of a categorized land use category that can be used by the agencies for analysis. So for each one, and for the ones that aren't exactly obvious, we also have an evidence box. So if you look at impoundment, the next one down, there's evidence, so that it sort of, what the evidence does is it sort of reflects what the decision process was in selecting what you selected as a rank for these things. So for buffer encroachment, the first one, we look at the map here. I should mention that for people who aren't entirely familiar with rapid assessment, it's typically an on-site assessment, takes less than a day. And for the rapid assessments that I've done, I always support it with a map. And it's made in GIS, and what I have on here is a 30-meter buffer and a 150-meter buffer, and it helps me answer a few of the questions. So one of the questions the 30-meter buffer helps me answer is if there's buffer encroachment. So this is just what the proportion of buffer encroachment is, non-naturally vegetated area, and it gets a score based on that. Impoundment and tidal restriction, this marsh is not impounded. Several marshes in the state are. We actually didn't have any, well, we had a few impounded marshes in this study, but none that were totally impounded and degraded from impoundment. Then we have ditching and draining intensity. And you can't see the ditches on this in this photo, but there are quite a few ditches, and it was somewhere between low and moderate. Typically, we're estimating whether it's low or moderate or high, but we do have a key taken from, I think, one of Charlie Roman's papers that analyzed what the ditching intensity on marshes were, and we just broke it into categories. Thanks. Pressing the wrong buttons. All right, so wetland disturbances continued. The fourth metric is anthropogenic nutrients. Now, this is one of the least straightforward, so this is one of the more subjective ones. So the evidence is really critical here, but for this particular marsh, we saw sources and some impacts evident. So the impacts are what's really not straightforward. So, there were a few houses along the edge of the marsh. They were not sewered, because there's no sewers that go out there. There was some sewage smell, unusually tall Spartina SA. It's known to be high nutrient water because historic land use was unsewered properties all around the pond. Dense and tall phragmites right along where the houses were. So we said that was pretty good evidence to say that they were anthropogenic nutrients. Filling and dumping within the wetland. This is something that's pretty clearly evident. You can see a fill line, a straight edge along the aerial photo. You go check it out. There's bricks and stuff in the sediments. Doesn't look natural. So along where those houses were, there was a small amount of filling. Ideally it would be what the area of the marsh that was filled, but we usually just use perimeter because a lot of times you can't tell what area was filled. Next one is edge erosion. So edge erosion and crab burrows, we decided to keep them separate. So this isn't just natural edge erosion, which, ice scour and a little bit of erosion from wave action. We're talking about deep erosion, deep into the peat, and you'd be surprised at how many of our marshes had a high amount, greater than 60% edge erosion, deep into the peat. It's a big problem. So another thing the rapid assessment can do is it can let you know what's going on across multiple wetlands. So edge erosion was something that really surprised me. Typically, it is correlated with crab burrow intensity. Not in this case. There was quite a bit of edge erosion, but there was no crab burrowing. So that brings us to the next metric. It's crab burrowing is, it's basically Mark Burtness, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, brought to light that a lot of this edge dieback that we've been seeing is a result of a competitive or a consumer interaction between crabs and their predators. We think that might be the case. It definitely has to do with an overabundance of crabs, whatever the mechanism is. And we do see a lot of edges that are eroded with lots of pock marks, Swiss cheese peat at the edge. And I don't know if you really looked at that first slide that we had, but we have some pretty extensive dieback there, but none at this particular marsh. So ponding and die-off, so this is basically signs of marsh drowning. This is what we saw a lot of at this particular marsh that is concerning. There's quite a bit of it here. It's basically, if there's less than 60% cover of vegetation and it's a shallow depression, typically with water in it, we're going to call it ponding and die-off. Vegetation, cutting, removal, soil disturbance. This is, active mowing or cutting or driving on the marsh, which this one didn't have. Also, if any cutting in the zone where the marsh is migrating to, so look over the fence, and if someone's yard is loaded with black grass that's been mowed, you would count that too. And then Phragmites in the wetland. So the sum of those scores was 71. There's 10 of them. The average is 7.1, and that is our disturbance score. So that brings us to the next one, and this is the one that I'm most psyched about, just because it's fun. So this is our index of marsh integrity. So this is, it's based on the sensitivity of community types to sea level rise, other stresses, and then also to a small portion, the habitat value of various community types. So if anyone's familiar with floristic quality assessment, where individual vegetation species are given a coefficient based on their sensitivity to disturbance, this is similar to that, but because there's not much vegetation or species turnover in marshes, we use these vegetation types instead, and we're looking at the cover or the proportion on the marsh of these various vegetation types. So like salt shrub, brackish marsh, Phragmites, meadow high marsh, SA high marsh, and they're all defined here in the bottom right-hand corner. And they're all assigned a coefficient by Dr. Charlie Roman, by 4 of us. Charlie Roman from the National Park Service, Kathy Wigan from EPA Atlantic Ecology Division, Kenny Raposa from the Narragansett Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and myself. We went through this worksheet, which you can see in the upper left-hand corner. And so it's, 4 points based on sensitivity to sea level rise, 4 points based on sensitivity to other stresses, 2 points based on habitat value, and that gives us our coefficient. So a salt marsh that is dominated by meadow high marsh, which has a coefficient of 10, brackish native marsh, coefficient of 10, salt shrub, low marsh would get, a score of about approaching 10. Whereas something that's, dominated by Phragmites, is drowning in place with lots of die-off depressions and dieback peat would have a score approaching 0, based on the proportion of each community on the marsh. And now how we determine the proportion is unique. And so if you look at the lower left-hand corner, you can see kind of lightly drawn in there with pen, 8 transects. So every marsh is separated into 8 transects running from upland to marsh edge, evenly spaced from a random starting point. And rather than the time-consuming and labor-intensive, putting quadrats out there or pulling a tape measure and putting a rod down with a tape measure, we just walk the transects. And every step that we take over one of these community types is considered a data point. So it's a data point. It's tallied as a data point for that type. So we go to the next here. So this is an actual data sheet for Winnapaug Marsh. And you can see that in the upper left-hand corner, the first transect, T1, you know, we probably walked in Phragmites first for 4 steps, and then maybe went to Meadow High Marsh for 13 steps, right? And then maybe went to SA High Marsh for 8 steps, right? So this gives us, you know, the relative proportion for each transect, and we do that for all of these transects. Yes. So then we take the data from the transects, the tallies from the transects. So, and if we look at this here, we look at salt shrub, which has a coefficient of 9, and we look at the total tally 71. That means that across all of these transects, we stepped in salt shrub 71 times out of, at the bottom, if you look at sums, out of 1,126 steps that we took across those 8 transects, 71 of those were in salt shrub. So one thing I should say about the steps is I'm a tall guy, so my steps are almost a meter. But as long as you take even steps, it doesn't matter if you're tall or small, it's all relative, right? So it's all the number, compared to the number of total steps, the number of steps you took. So if you look at this, you know, Phragmites, I took 88 steps in Phragmites. For mixed high marsh, 214 steps. Die-off depression, 301 steps in die-off bare depression out of 1126, right? So now if you multiply each of these total tallies by the coefficient, you will get this CCI times TT column. If you sum up that column and divide it by the total number of steps, that gives you your index, which you see at the right. So this got a 4.7 out of possible 10. So what does that mean? So here's a conceptual figure that shows you, basically shows you what IMI is telling you. So if you look on the right-hand side at this key is sorted by the coefficient. So salt shrub is a coefficient of 10, I think, or maybe 9. But also it's sorted by, you know, moving from upland to the water's edge. So if you tip this key over on its side, this would give you the bar graphs over here. So we can see, if you look at the top at Sheffield Cove, Jacobs Point Outer with high IMI values, you can see that they're typical like Miller and Egler 1950 salt marshes, right? Dominated by Meadow High Marsh in the dark green, with a band of salt shrub, a band of low marsh, not very much SA on the high marsh, just some, not much dieback, maybe a little erosion, right? Those are the ones that scored high. Whereas if you go to the bottom here, and we look at the marsh that we looked at, Winnapaug, it's got a little band of salt shrub, but then the next one, the dark green over, that's Meadow High Marsh, almost no Meadow High Marsh, very little Meadow High Marsh. And look at how much in the yellow SA High Marsh there is. So, you know, we've had studies that show that SA High Marsh takes over the Meadow High Marsh as sea levels rise. We can also see that we walked in a lot of die-off bare depression. Compared to the sites at the top that don't have much die-off, this marsh has a whole lot of die-off. So I also want to note that the next one down, Quaney East, is a marsh that the state recently has restored using thin layer placement. So marsh elevation enhancement restoration. And you can see that it was in similar condition to Winnapaug. Another salt pond marsh. These tend to be low on the elevation table, and they seem to be the first ones to be drowning in place. So we didn't have this data when Caitlin and the state and her partners decided to restore Quaney East. So, I mean, what it shows us is that, you know, it really documents what we're seeing sort of anecdotally into something that's a little bit more scientific. So for validation, just in the matter of saving time here, let's just look at these 3 here. So we have IMI is in the column there. This is just correlation analysis. IMI versus median elevation, you know, a moderate relationship there. So IMI also reflects disturbance sort of moderately to modestly, but the additive effects of wetland disturbance and median elevation on IMI is strong. And if you think back to where I was describing how we design the IMI, I think it's pretty much, it's doing its job with, you know, of course, environmental noise that would be in any metric. And I'm not going to go into the other stuff right now. And then finally, we have a rapid migration metric. So in the state, we have SLAM. We have you know, statewide salt marsh migration estimation models. But this is different in that it looks at a specific salt marsh and is this particular salt marsh going to migrate? So I mean, that's what I mean by it estimates and rank biological opportunity. Well, there's the opportunity. There's actually salt marsh vegetation there, you know, that we're going to assess whether it's going to migrate or not. So like the SLAM model, geomorphic, hydrologic, bathtub type stuff goes on, you know, what's the flooding regime going to be? We use that information. But we also use, you know, vegetative resistance and perceived social resistance, so like the intensity, value, and perceived permanence of various land uses. So again, if you look to the left-hand side, again, it's a model based on a 1/10% estimating from the aerial photographs to the 1/10% what land use types are here. It scores them all by their perceived resistance to migration, and we get three metrics from that. One metric is migration potential score, which is basically of the land that is adjacent to the wetland, what's the migration potential on a scale of 1 to 10? I don't think it's the most useful score, but some of the restoration practitioners wanted me to keep it in there, so we kept it in. Other two scores, which this isn't a very good model for this particular marsh. Likely conservation area is of the land that's adjacent to the marsh that has potential. The highest potential, the two highest potential categories, moderately high and high, which is basically doesn't take management in order for the marsh to migrate. What's the area of that land? And so that gives you information. So like for a very big marsh, which has low potential, it might still have a pretty big area of land that could be conserved for marsh restoration. And then the last one is conservation ratio. And it says, well, how big is that area compared to the marsh? So if we have a marsh that has a ratio that the conservation area is as large as the marsh, then we could expect that the marsh will migrate inland without much management. And that might be how we want to address the marsh. You know, if it doesn't have, if the ratio is low, that the marsh is much bigger than the area that it can easily migrate onto, then we have to do some management action. So the MarshRAM data was designed to support decision making, and here's the decision support matrix that we developed that uses the MarshRAM data, and I'll just go over a little bit how it works. So these are sorted exactly the way that we saw the IMI graph sorted by the IMI score. So Sheffield Cove's at the top, Winnapaug and Quaney are at the bottom. It's based on IMI, which is, you know, the marsh platform integrity. And to make it easier to interpret, we separated all of these metrics into bins. So the bins are based on quartiles, where the lowest or best score for each one is in green, and it's the upper quartile of scores. The lowest quartile of scores is in red, and it's and the rest, intermediate, moderate, whatever it ends up being, 50% are the interquartile range of the data that we collected. So we did that for all of these, but it's sorted by the IMI bin. So right away you can see that elevation and disturbance and IMI are all related, right? So if you look at towards the bottom where Winnapaug is, Winnapaug's sort of the outlier here, but most of them, in the most disturbed column have low elevation and high disturbance. And then they have the vegetation shows that as the most disturbed vegetation. And same for the high level stuff. Next column over, you'll see that we have F and V. That's the functions and values. Remember I talked about the that metric that I had in the classification information at the beginning that ranked the functions and values. Well, this is the sum of those scores. Also put into categories, AA meaning above average, A meaning average, and B below average, sum of scores. So it just gives you an idea of like the functions and values or perceived or estimated in the field of these various types, just to give more information that can be looked into further by the manager. And then we have the next three columns are the migration potential ones that we just talked about. And then to the right of that are the metrics, are the disturbance metrics. So, you know, if we have high disturbance, we can look to the right and say, well, what are the disturbances? And one thing that you'll see, I was talking about erosion. So if you go over to the column that says erosion between fill and crabs, you'll see that there was high erosion. That's greater than 60% of the marsh edge was eroded on that many sites with the 3 X's. So I think it's pretty unbelievable. And this is deep erosion. I'm not just a little bit of erosion. But anyway, so we can see that Winnipaug, where it fell, Quaney East. If we look, we already started restoring that, but I think it was a pretty good selection by Caitlin and her crew. You know, low elevation, they're doing an elevation enhancement, high disturbance, most disturbed, one of the most disturbed marshes as far as the IMI goes, high functions and values, high migration potential, 5.3 hectares, but that's only 19% of the marsh. So I think it was a pretty good decision, but this just helps in some of the decisions that can be made here. And that's it for my presentation. I just want to thank our contributors and our program support, and you know, it's only made possible through collaborations. Thank you to NUIPIC and for our, you know, for all the information we get from those NUIPIC meetings with all of our adjacent states. And if you want to contact us, here's the contact information. I assume this will be up on the NUIPIC website, but I will leave it at this here, and I can move around. If there's questions, I can move around to any slide, and we can answer questions. So thank you.
And I do have a question, actually from Courtney Schmidt out of Narragansett Estuary Program. How do you score the ecosystem function and services? Is this best professional judgment, or do you have a rubric to follow?
That's a very good question, and it's something I've been thinking about. So this year, and last year, we developed sort of standardized ways where we would do this. So, you know, something like carbon storage. Well, you know, we know that all marshes store carbon. Well, some of our marshes might not be actively gaining carbon at the moment since they're drowning in place. They might actually be a source of carbon. I think some people have found that that might be the case. So yeah, we need to develop users guidance, and that says, okay, that's our rule. So I have the rules that I've used, and they're just in my head. But yes, that's a very good question. We do need to develop a rubric for that, and that's something that's going to be done probably over the next couple of years, or you know, we'll jot them down for now, but then as we write the users guidance, they'll definitely be in that. So thanks for that question. Very good question.
Question from Kathleen Walls of New Jersey. How were the habitat TCI values developed?
Okay, well, let's see. Okay, this worksheet, oops, I went by it. Oops, that's not it. There it is. So in the upper left-hand corner, if you look carefully at this worksheet, it is, you'll see at the bottom of it, it says sensitivity. So there's 4 potential scores for each column. So sensitivity to sea level rise, sensitivity to all other stresses. So if it was this was between the four of us. We made these decisions together, first separately, then discussed them, then made these decisions together. If it was sensitive to stress, it got a 4. If it was the end result of stress or thrived on stress, it would get a 0, or anywhere in between. Neutral to stress, we get a 2. And then for habitat value, it was just low, medium, or high. It got a 0, 1, or 2. The most you could score would be a 10. The lowest you could score would be a 0.
Hi. I think this has been fantastic. I've been looking forward to reading and catching up on all of this stuff, so I'm really excited that this webinar happened. I know you guys worked with the Estuarine Research Reserve, and I know they were working on a similar but probably super different thing of CC-VATCH. How do these compare, or and I don't think they're comparable because I know yours is rapid, but is there a way to use them in conjunction with each other, or is one better suited than the other for different things? I haven't been keeping up, so I was wondering if you guys had any comments on that.
Sure. I was involved in CC-VATCH. CC-VATCH is much more detailed, and it looks at all different habitats besides salt marshes. It can be done on salt marshes, but it's fairly intensive. It's based on research and fairly intensive. I don't think it could be substituted for what we're doing here, and I don't think this could be substituted for that. So they have slightly different uses. I think CC-VATCH doesn't just look at the disturbances and sea level rise, but all factors involved with climate change, such as warming and plants migrating due to warming temperatures and different amounts of carbon in the atmosphere and how that might affect habitats. So it's much more thorough and intensive and research based. So,
but not field based.
Not field based. So that's
okay.
the answer I can give you. I don't think they're interchangeable.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Courtney.
And thank you all so much. The webinar is now going to end.
Thank you.
Thanks, Audra. Thanks, everybody.